Mavuika has been out for a couple of days now, and since I've had the chance to properly test her out more extensively, I thought I'd deliver my more fleshed out thoughts on the character, evaluate whether my pre-release pros and cons were accurate or not, and give my opinion on where I currently think she stands in the meta. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So first off, I mentioned that she would have top tier pyro damage. This 100% ended up being true. If you're looking for the strongest pyro damage dealer in the game, then Mavuika will give you that in spades. Assuming that you have Shilonen, she power creeps every previous pyro DPS, no questions asked. Whether that be in Vaporize or Forward Melt teams, or just any team where a pyro can play. She cooks Xiangling in terms of damage output, she cooks Arlecchino in terms of damage output, she cooks Linny in terms of damage output. If there's a pyro DPS that exists, then yes, this honorary son of Caledon will run them over without even so much as a glance back. So if you want to play the absolute best pyro DPS in all of Genshin Impact, then this flaming lady is 100% the right choice for you. She really does feel like the goddess of war whenever you play her as a main DPS. And at last, Xiangling has competition. It only took the game like 5 years. Next up, I want to talk about how I mentioned that the Exalted Pyro Archon would end up buffing old pre-existing Natlan teams. That did pretty much end up being the case. Oh my goodness, I am so happy that I can finally play a Pyro Plier with my Kinich who doesn't need energy recharge. That is one of the biggest W's that Mavuika carries with her. She is such an upgrade to those teams, and I am thrilled about that. With Mualani, yep, assuming that you have enough power application, she will generally always be an upgrade for the Shark Surfer. And as for Chaska teams, I said that it would be somewhat of an awkward synergy, because you would always have to end up sacrificing Chaska's A1 in order to use Mavuika with her. This is assuming that your Chaska is C0 for the record. Essentially, we all know how Chaska at C0 really enjoys soup teams. She wants to play with 3 different elements in her teams at all times, so that you're able to get her 4th A1 bullet. But by putting Mavuika in Chaska's team, you have to end up dealing with her A1 bullets being more RNG. Generally speaking, it's worth doing so because Mavuika's sub-DPS is just that high, the legendary Pyro Ring if you will. And she's able to buff Chaska quite nicely via her A4. So in terms of all of the pre-existing Natlan DPSs, yes, Mavuika was indeed an upgrade to all of their teams, especially Kinich. That is the one Natlan DPS team where I feel like there is absolutely zero drawbacks to their synergy whatsoever. I did also mention how she was gonna be nuts with Shilonen, and that ended up being very, very true, to the point where it feels a little bit restrictive, but we're gonna get onto that later. If you want to play this character as an on-field DPS, that DJ Cat is going to be your absolute best friend. Quick 90 Nightsoul consumption with 2 kicks and you're good to go. That's not even mentioning her absurd synergy with Sitlali. Mavuika boasts some of the most powerful forward melt teams in the entire game. I was saying this, I was saying that melt would be a good reaction if Hoyo gave it some attention, and look what happened. The moment they gave it any attention, it ended up being good. However, I would also like to mention that it's not just Natlan teams that she ended up buffing. Coco Goat teams, anyone? I have to say, her synergy with Melt Ganyu is so good. Any Ganyu lovers here know how good this character feels to play with Mavuika. It's insane. Applying Pyro on Frostflake Arrow Hit is legendary. It is genuinely legendary. I have heard of some people who genuinely do not like Ganyu's playstyle whatsoever saying that she finally feels good to play to them because of a legendary Pyro Ring. I am so happy that this synergy works as a big Ganyu fan myself. And yes, she did end up being a buff to Coriander Overload teams. She can also generally fit into any team where you can also pair Shilonen with her. Because that DJ Cat has flexibility equal to Kazuha, if not more than him, while being able to provide the Nightsoul consumption necessary to generate Fighting Spirit. I also mentioned how she was going to end up having insane Primo-Based investment. Yup, I had just assumed it based on this. Every time a new Archon comes out, their constellations have progressively gotten better and better over time. Oh my goodness, Mavuika 100% keeps up with that trend, because hear me out, she has the best C6 in the entire game. No other character comes close. Not even C6 Arlecchino, not even C6 Arla. I would say the closest to her damage would be a C6 Mualani. Otherwise, literally no one can compete with a C6 Mavuika. She is stupidly busted in terms of the whale meta right now, and even if you look at more realistic Dolphin tier investment, this honorary son of Caledon shreds the game at C2. Listen, you can make an argument for Mavuika versus the other Pyro DPSs at C0 due to things like shield and restrictiveness as an example, but the moment you give them constellations, if you're comparing a constellated Arla to a constellated Mavuika, it's not even close, not even by a little bit. The Exalted Pyro Archon easily holds the new strongest constellation lineup in all of Genshin Impact. Even if you can only manage to get one of her constellations, it will be huge for her. With that being said, allow me to remind you that C0 is absolutely enough to clear everything in this game. You do not need the insane level of power that constellations unlock on her, but yes, she does indeed have wild Primo-Based investment. So I also said that she would have the potential to rival Neuvillette. Kinda. Now if we look at it only in terms of personal damage, yes, she cooks him. However, when we consider team damage, things become a little different. Let's assume that you're playing Celestia Killer Neuvillette at a very achievable investment level. Our beloved Lady Farina down at C0 holding a Favonius sword. Now you might be thinking, okay, her personal damage isn't really going to be doing all that much. Which is fair, her personal damage only really kicks in at C2 onwards. However, when she's being buffed by Kazuha and Shieldon at once, she will actually be able to put in some good work. So when we look at it in terms of team damage on the whole, they're actually a lot closer than you think. I would like to say that the Exalted Pyro Archon does in fact have a higher damage ceiling, not to mention that she's also a better character in general because you can play her as a support. With that being said, she doesn't just rival Neuvillette, she is better than him. However, I don't want anyone going and thinking that it's by this incredibly huge, unbeatable margin. If you want to value them as DPSs on their own and totally ignore team damage, then yes, Mavuika 100% cooks him and it's not even close. On to some of the negatives that I talked about. I mentioned how her being a DPS Archon would be kinda worrying for the future of her. And yes, I do think that to a degree, it is a little bit troubling that she's a DPS Archon, because if we all remember Raiden Shogun, she's fallen off pretty hard as the damage ceiling has gradually increased. However, the fact of the matter is, that just doesn't matter right now. She's not gonna get power crept for at least a year, unless Hoyoverse goes crazy and decides to power creep an Archon in that little amount of time, but generally, I don't think that's going to happen. She is the strongest Pyro DPS right now. I really hope they take a break from making Pyro DPSs so that she can enjoy that role for a while. And in all fairness, Raiden was really good during Inazuma. She was pretty solid during Sumeru. It's only in Fontaine where we got the crazy spike in power levels that she started to fall off dramatically. I will say, I do wish that Hoyoverse leaned a little bit more into her supportive capabilities. It is a little disappointing that they went so hard on the DPS thing. However, it's not like her off-field playstyle is bad by any means. In fact, I would say they managed it quite well. An off-field Mavuika honestly feels better than an off-field Raiden, because she does really solid sub-DPS while she's doing that, not to mention that her pyro application is pretty decent, it can cover you in most scenarios, and if you need more pyro application than that, then you can just use Xiangling. So while this kit design has made her somewhat of a ticking time bomb, at least for the time being, she is S tier, and she is going to be S tier for a very long time. Next up, I want to talk about her Nightsoul Restrictions. She's ridiculously limited as a main carry because you need to use Shilonen or Sitlali with her, which I just find so silly. There are most definitely people who saw her in the original trailers and have been saving up for her ever since they first saw her, and now they've pulled for her, they skipped Shilonen, and now what do? I suppose they're Sitlali. It is a good thing, but at least Sitlali works as well. But even then, the Nightsoul restriction is pretty rough. No other Archon has been tied to another character like this before. Think about it. Sure, Venti might not work most of the time, but he was still functional on his own. Same for Zhongli, same for Raiden Shogun, same for Nihida, same for our beloved Lady Farina. Sure, she likes having a healer on her team, but that healer doesn't have to be from Fontaine. And okay, there's the normal attacks thing, but that doesn't really apply to every character. It feels like Hoyoverse put this into place so that it would be really easy to write her out of history whenever we move on to Vinod Cry, whenever we move on to Sneznaya, and whenever we stop getting Natlan characters in general. Because here's the thing. They are most certainly afraid of what they created with our beloved Lady Farina. They know how broken she is. They know how she is really hard to write out of history. Because in order to make our dear Hydro Archon totally obsolete, you either make healers obsolete somehow, or you make damage bonus % obsolete somehow. And sure, in turn for these restrictions, you end up getting an absolute banger Pyro DPS. Like, Mavuika is strong, don't get me wrong, her power absolutely impresses, but with that being said, it's undeniable that these restrictions are very disappointing. This is certainly going to be a major turnoff for a lot of people, and it's going to be one of the biggest advertisements for some people to go and pull for Arlecchino and Linny even when we have the Exalted Pyro Archon in the game. Because those two don't need the DJ Cat. Speaking of which, I did mention how the absolute biggest con in regards to Mavuika would be that we just have so many Pyro DPSs already. Her off-field capabilities are definitely nothing to sneeze at. They are excellent, don't get me wrong, it would be very, very foolish of me to totally ignore them. But power creeping Arlecchino when she's only really had 5 patches in the spotlight is kinda rough. Even if it fits thematically, it's still such a strange decision in my opinion. To be honest, the fact that there's so many power DPSs doesn't really link to her meta value, because she is the best of them all ultimately. It's more so just a point of contention that I have with the unit. All I can really hope for now is that Hoyo will just take a break from making power DPSs. I'm sick of them. We've got so many of them now. Mavuika is the absolute cream of the crop. We don't need any more of them. However, as I said earlier, Arla and Linny don't need Nightsoul in order to work, and that is one of the biggest advertisements for them, especially considering how flexible those two are teams-wise. She's as strong as it gets when it comes to DPSs at the moment, but I'm worried as to how she will age. Will she be cooked the moment that we leave Natlan to head to the Nord Cry? Will she get power crept quickly in the later regions due to HP inflation? These are questions which we'll just have to wait to get the answer to. I'm seriously hoping for the best here. Definitely let me know about your opinions on Mavuika's kit down below. Did she end up impressing you, or is she as mid as can be? I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, I have a ZZZ second channel. Head on over and subscribe if you're interested in some fun, silly ZZZ content. Hopefully this video was able to tell you my more developed opinions on Mavuika now that we've had her out for a while. This has been Juice, signing out, and do you think that Mavuika has 0 Mora at all times due to having to constantly pay for gas?